Thank you, Jenny, and thank you, everyone, for coming. Um, just to say that I've divided there's a number of quotations, and I've divided them up between myself and my wife, Elizabeth, and so you'll get a different selection of voices. Detachment. Would we normally think that being detached is a good thing? Many people would say not, because they assume that detachment implies being uncaring and indifferent to the suffering of others. And this seems to be against Christian beliefs. I think that most of us would believe that compassion is one of the highest virtues. We might think that being detached shows a lack of compassion and instead a coldness and callousness towards our fellows. So, why would great teachings from the past extol the virtue of detachment? We need to understand what detachment really means. Can we be detached and at the same time function in the world with compassion? This is the subject of this evening's talk. I am going to draw upon two sources. One is from the Advaita tradition, and the other is from Meister Eckhart, the late 13th and early 14th century Christian mystic. Advaita means literally not two. It does not say one, because this implies a number, whereas the unity of which Advaita speaks is beyond all description, including number. It is the tradition of the Patanjali Yoga Sutras and Bhagavad Gita. Some eminent scholars say that to try to bring together teachings from different traditions in this way is unhelpful. They may disagree about the similarities as I see them. I am no expert in either of these traditions, but I ask you to hear the presentation and judge for yourself. So I'm just going to share the screen. For a definition of a detachment, let us look at Meister Eckhart. Meister Eckhart's beautiful poetic description. Detachment is a mind that stands unmoved by all accidents of joy or sorrow, honor, shame, or disgrace, as a mountain of lead stands unmoved by a breath of wind. God has stood in this unmoved detachment for all eternity and still so stands. Meister Eckhart was not only a master of theology, but as these words illustrate, he was a master of words, and they carry such power as well as beauty that it is difficult not to be moved by them. We will come back to Eckhart later, but let us start further back by at least 1,000 years with the Sanskrit word for detachment, which is vairagya. We find in the Monia-Williams dictionary that the word vairagya has a variety of meanings, including, so this is the Monia-Williams definition of vairagya. It's a growing loathing of freedom from all worldly desires, indifference to worldly objects and to life, to become weary or exhausted. The Y part of Vairagya has the meaning of asunder, away. And the raga, which is a long R in raga, is to do with passion, love, affection, desire. And it comes from the Dhatu ranj, meaning to be reddened, be attracted to. We know that the colour red is associated with heat and passion, and hence the root of the Sanskrit word. Together, the word is to do with casting asunder or moving away from passion and desire. As a side note to the structure of Sanskrit words, please note that in Sanskrit all words are derived from what are called dhatus, which are like seeds. The definitions quoted are capturing the essence or quality of the seed, which then develops to form the word. We find the word Vairagya used in Sutras 112 and 115 of the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, a text which is dated from somewhere between 300 BC and 100 AD.
Through practice and dispassion arises restraint. Dispassion is the knowledge of mastery in one who thirsts not for conditions seen or heard.
The words detachment and dispassion are interchangeable. This teaching on yoga, which is all about union with the Absolute, is formed of 4 books of sutras. A sutra is a succinct statement, and there are there for one to contemplate for one's whole life. They are not immediately understandable on account of their profundity. One might think that one understands their meaning, but one of the aspects of Sanskrit which makes it exciting is that rather like subatomic physics, the observer plays an essential role, and therefore the meaning is never fixed and varies with the depth of the vision of the observer. The word remains constant, but in time, the understanding deepens. So I'm not going to try and explain what these 2 sutras mean, but they are there to be reflected upon. And it is of great value to revisit the word Vairagya and the sutras from Patanjali and contemplate their meaning. A more recent teacher, Swami Shivananda, has said,
"There is verily no sword more powerful than Vairagya to cut off all sorts of attachment to this world. Hold the sword in your hand and march along the spiritual path. You will safely reach the goal."
What are we attached to? Emotions, ideas, food, places, possessions, people. The list is endless. Even though one learns to let go of some things, we nevertheless tend to carry a lot of baggage. There is a story of Bede Griffiths who, when he first went to India, took as his only possessions a table and a bed, only to be regarded by the villagers as a man of great wealth. He found this situation unpalatable and thereupon immediately gave them up, which is a fine example of detachment. And I was just thinking this morning of another story which appears in a book by Viktor Frankl, which is called Man's Search for Meaning. Viktor Frankl was a psychiatrist who was in Auschwitz, and he tells of how the people coming to Auschwitz on entering thought that they would not be able to, well, the particular thing he mentions is that they have to sleep 6 to a 9-foot bed, and they all complain that they would never be able to do that. But in fact, he mentions that after 2 weeks, they were all sleeping sound as if it was quite normal. Recently, I watched the old television series called Tenko. And one scene at the beginning shows the English prisoners being marched to their camp, a journey of a few days in sweltering heat. They started out with as many possessions as they can carry, but as time goes by, they discard more and more until they arrive with virtually nothing. This story illustrates how so many things we find valuable can be disposed of when a situation requires it. It is not an example of voluntary detachment as in the Bede Griffiths story, but shows that when the situation demands it, we can or must let go. There are most certainly different levels of attachment, and the most difficult to let go are buried deep within us. One of Patanjali's sutras is on being attached to the feeling of existence itself. We are attached to our own life. And for most of us, this must be one of the last areas to let go of. At the other end of the scale are the senses, through which we are attached to simple pleasures. Giving up simple pleasures during the period of Lent, which started recently, is a way of practicing detachment. Many spiritual paths encourage us to consider the question of how permanent a thing is. The Advaitis say that anything that is not eternal is also unreal. Even a place in heaven is said to be unreal, inasmuch as it is temporary and falls short of the ultimate on account of its impermanence. Our aim should be for the eternal and not something which withers and fades with time. Shakespeare describes this state of affairs powerfully in the following sonnet.
Poor soul, the centre of my sinful earth, fooled by these rebel powers that thee array. Why dost thou pine within and suffer dearth, painting thy outward walls so costly gay? Why so large cost, having so short a lease, dost thou upon thy fading mansions spend? Shall worms, inheritors of this excess, eat up thy charge? Is this thy body's end? Then, soul, live thou upon thy servant's loss, and let that pine to aggravate thy store. Buy terms divine in selling hours of dross. Within be fed. Without be rich no more. So shalt thou feed on death that feeds on men. And death once dead, there's no more dying then.
Shakespeare is saying that the care of the soul is the most important element in our lives, and the body, whilst being an essential instrument while we are on earth, is only temporary and should not therefore be regarded as the master. Similarly, Socrates believed that humans are a combination of body and soul, and that death is the point at which they separate. If one's life has been spent always listening to the needs of the body, then at death, the soul would try to find a new body as quickly as possible. And in that situation, almost anybody will do. But according to Socrates, at death, unencumbered by the demands of the body, the soul could rise to greater things. For him, a life well spent was spent in preparing oneself for death. And this meant restraint from all the attractions led by the senses. The body certainly constantly pulls us away by its desires. This is illustrated by the analogy of a chariot drawn by horses, which requires the charioteer to hold them back. The horses being the senses, and the charioteer representing the power of reason or discrimination. This is another way of describing vairagya. Both Patanjali and Meister Eckhart held that the greatest power to assist us in the cultivation of vairagya is silence. Patanjali's second sutra says, yoga is the restraint of fluctuations of the mind, which I've also seen translated as yoga is establishing the mind in stillness. Meister Eckhart, who lived in the 13th and 14th centuries, said, the most powerful prayer, one well nigh omnipotent, and the worthiest work of all, is the outcome of a quiet mind. The quieter the mind, the more powerful, the worthier, the deeper, the more telling and more perfect the prayer is. To the quiet mind, all things are possible. What is a quiet mind? A quiet mind is one which nothing weighs on, nothing worries, which, free from ties and from all self-seeking, is wholly merged into the will of God and dead to its own. Such a one can do no deed, however small, that is not clothed with something of God's power and authority. It behoves us to pray hard so that all our mortal members with their powers, eyes, heart, mouth, and all their senses, are turned in that direction, and we must never stop until we find ourselves on the point of union with Him we have in mind and are praying to, namely God. Meister Eckhart was born in Erfurt in Germany. He became a Dominican monk, and as a result of 2 long periods of study in Paris, which I think in total about 15 years, he acquired the title of Meister. He wrote in 2 languages. His theological works are written in Latin, and his sermons and other writings in German. The Latin works are very scholarly and academic, and not quite so easily understandable. The sermons and other writings, including on detachment, are in German, and whilst requiring multiple readings and much reflections, can, in my opinion, be understood. He does, however, set the bar very high for attaining the perfect state of detachment, and understanding this high state from the point of view of actual personal experience is not easily achieved. This also brings up an important point, which is that this is not only theory. Eckhart emphasized the need to live and practice this in our lives. This being under the auspices of the Theosophical Society, I feel it necessary to say a little about the use of the word God. Madame Blavatsky often seems to speak in a disparaging way about Christians and their idea of God. Eckhart is a Dominican friar and a distinguished theologian, and he speaks of nothing else but God. My aim at this point is to show that Eckhart's view of God and the God of which Madame Blavatsky spoke so disparagingly about are not the same. They could not be further apart. To explain this, in addition to the word God, Eckhart also uses the term Godhead, which is equivalent to the Absolute or Brahman, about which nothing can be said, as it is beyond all understanding. It is unspeakable and does not ever enter creation. Likewise, the God, according to Eckhart, is beyond time and is in a realm for which, for want of a better word, we might term as eternity. The other God which Eckhart mentions constantly is none other than a description of the highest state of being in creation. This distinction is the same as between Brahman, which is beyond description, and Brahma, the creator God. Whenever Eckhart uses the word Godhead, he means Parabrahm. But he often uses the word God, where it is not totally clear whether he is referring to the God in creation or the Godhead beyond. For example, Eckhart says that we are made in God's image, and that in preparing oneself for God, one is making oneself godlike. But the Godhead is like nothing. So a question to pose is, does this mean that we shall also become nothing? strange as it may seem, it is quite likely that Eckhart did actually mean just this. But is it possible to become nothing? Because nothing, in the sense used, is no thing. And becoming it, therefore, is an impossibility, since everything in creation is a thing. Once again, there are no quick answers, and this requires deep contemplation. God, says Eckhart, can only give himself completely and not in parts. And this is why everything else has to go, and there cannot be anything held onto. Eckhart says God wants to be completely alone. And there are points where he almost seems to be saying that we are God. But he does not quite say that. Some say the reason for this is that he had to be careful so that he would not be accused of being a heretic. But it is worth noting that this is exactly what is said by the Advaitis in the Upanishads. There cannot be you and God because that is two, and there is only one. It might seem confusing, but I hope this explains why Madame Blavatsky's condemnation of the commonly held Christian idea of God is something totally different from Eckhart's concept. In his writing on detachment, Eckhart starts by giving his credentials, saying that he has read and studied far and wide, both pagan teachers as well as the Bible, in order to find out what is the highest and best virtue with which man can most completely and closely conform himself to God, with which he can by grace become that which God is by nature, and with which man can come most of all to resemble that image he was in God, and between which and God there was no distinction before ever God made created things. Following story, that reading is a remarkable statement made by Eckhart, because it's saying, before we were created, we were. This is referred to also in other sermons. Where were we before we were? And what does he mean by we? If there is nothing created, there is no distinction between anything, because no two things exist. The only conclusion that I draw from this is that before we were with God, and there was no distinction. In other words, perfect unity. To make this clear, before there was any creation, there was no distinction. This again is similar to the belief of the Advaitis. If there is no distinction, then our divinity is unquestionable. To be godlike, one requires detachment, because the Godhead is detached. And Eckhart cites two examples of God's detachment from all things. He says, all the prayers and good works that man can do in time affect God's detachment as little as if no prayers or good works had ever occurred in time. And God never became more ready to give or more inclined towards a man than if he had never uttered the prayer or performed the good works. I say still further, when the Son in the Godhead wanted to become man, and he became man and endured martyrdom, that affected God's unmoved detachment as little as if he had never become man. These statements seem a little shocking even today, and I imagine they would have been even more so 800 years ago. However, it could be that it is we who have become simple-minded in our understanding, and that in Eckhart's time the common man had a greater capacity for understanding truth than we have today. Another attachment we have as human beings, especially in our age, is that we want to know. Many of us thirst for knowledge. Wanting to know or be the knower is another attachment, and Eckhart recognizes this. Where there is an object of knowing, he says that you have gone out of yourself into the world of creatures, and therefore have departed from being in or with God. He therefore calls the true knowing of which he speaks as more like an unknowing. On account of it, you are with God and indeed all-knowing, but you have not gone out into creation. There, as was said before, there is no distinction, and therefore nothing to be known. In the Advaita tradition, it would be where there is no difference between knowledge, the knower, and the known. In connection with this, I came across the following quotation from Bernard of Clairvaux, which helps us to work against this tendency to grasp knowledge for ourselves. According to the Upanishads, true knowledge is nothing other than knowing the self, and all other knowledge is worldly knowledge.
There are those who seek knowledge for the sake of knowledge. That is curiosity. There are those who seek knowledge to be known by others. That is vanity. There are those who seek knowledge in order to serve. That is love.
Eckhart sometimes makes statements in his sermons that are so far removed from our common experience that one can only listen in awe. He has transcended the normal way we consider creation. It is in this dimension that the inner man lives, if you can even speak about living, because living belongs to the temporal world and not to eternity, which is where our true self abides in its most silent state. This is referred to by Eckhart as the ground, or as it is in German, Grund. To illustrate this, we will now hear a passage from Sermon 87, in which Eckhart shows that any distinction is the opposite of union with the Godhead. Please note how different this is from how we would normally think, and also that it is difficult in this sermon to distinguish between God and Godhead, as he only uses the word God. I would like to leave a short silence after the next reading to rest in its profundity.
So we say that a man should be so poor that he neither is nor has any place for God to work in. To preserve a place is to preserve distinction. Therefore, I pray to God to make me free of God, for my essential being is above God, taking God as the origin of creatures. For in that essence of God, in which God is above being and distinction, there I was myself, and knew myself so as to make this man. Therefore, I am my own cause, according to my essence, which is eternal, and not according to my becoming, which is temporal. Therefore, I am unborn, and according to my unborn mode, I can never die. According to my unborn mode, I have eternally been, am now, and shall eternally remain. That which I am by virtue of birth must die and perish, for it is mortal, and so must perish with time. In my birth all things were born, and I was the cause of myself and all things. And if I had so willed it, I would not have been, and all things would not have been. If I were not, God would not be either. I am the cause of God's being God. If I were not, then God would not be God. But you do not need to know this.
In his writing on detachment, Eckhart poses two hypothetical questions by quoting both Mary and Jesus, where it would appear that they are not being detached. And if we were to follow their example, we would not be following Eckhart's advice on detachment. He answers these by saying, "Concerning this, you should know what the masters say, that in every man there are two kinds of men. The one is called the outer man, that is, the life of the senses. This man is served by the five senses, though the outer man functions by the power of the soul. The other is called the inner man, that is, man's inward nature. You should understand that the spiritual man who loves God makes use of the powers of the soul in the outer man only to the extent that the 5 outer senses need it. The inward nature is not concerned with the five senses, except insofar as it is a guide or ruler of those senses, guarding them so that they do not yield to sense objects in a bestial fashion, as some folks do who live for carnal pleasures like beasts unendowed with reason. Such people should be termed beasts rather than men. Later on, he says, love your God with all your heart. Now, some people use up all the powers of the soul in the outer man. These are people who turn all their senses and their reason towards perishable goods, knowing nothing of the inner man. Eckhart says that it is possible for the outer man to work in the world whilst the inner man remains detached. And he uses the following analogy. A door swings open and shuts on its hinge. I would compare the outer woodwork of the door to the outer man, and the hinge to the inner man. When the door opens and shuts, the boards move back and forth. The hinge stays in the same place and is never moved thereby. It is the same in this case, if you understand it rightly. Further on, he says,
here is an example from nature. If you heat a baker's oven and put in it dough of oats, rye, and wheat, there is only one heat in the oven, but it does not have the same effect on the different kinds of dough. For one turns into fine bread, the second coarse, and the third coarser still. And that is not the fault of the heat. It is due to the materials which are unalike. In the same way, God does not work alike in all our hearts. He works as he finds readiness and receptivity.
To be receptive is to be totally empty, which of course means totally detached. He says, if I want to write on a wax tablet, then anything written on the tablet already, however wonderful it may be, will prevent me from writing there. And if I want to write, I must erase or destroy whatever is on the tablet. And the tablet is never so suitable for me to write on as when there is nothing in it. On it. Similarly, if God is to write the highest on my heart, then everything called this and that must be expunged from my heart. And then my heart stands in detachment. Then God can work the highest according to his supreme will. Therefore, the object of a detached heart is neither this nor that. Having heard the wisdom of these sages from the past, what is one to do? Often one thinks that in order to achieve this state of detachment, one should withdraw from society and play no part in what, without doubt, is a difficult world which is dragging us in the opposite direction. Interestingly, Eckhart is often vocal in dissuading us from cutting ourselves off, and also of the overindulgence in prayer and ritual. He encourages us to be active and, in his words, fruitful. So how can we remain both detached and yet fully engaged in worldly activities? Reflecting on this passage about the inner man and outer man would be helpful for all of us. An Indian man told me the following advice given to him by his guru. His guru explained that if you sleep on a boat at night, then during the night you will drift and end up by morning lost and a long way away. However, if you drop your anchor, you will only drift in a circle around the anchor and can soon be back on course. To me, dropping your anchor means always being connected to your inner man. And this idea is confirmed in the Bhagavad Gita, where Krishna instructs Arjuna to dedicate all his actions to him in order to be free from karma. He says, therefore, constantly unattached, perform that action which is your duty. Indeed, by performing action while unattached, man attains the supreme. Every action that we perform will bring its inevitable consequences, but we are being told here that the only way to be free from karma is to give up all fruits of action and to perform them as a sacrifice. This is how we can live in the world but not be ruled by the world. It establishes that connection with the inner man, and you are anchored and cannot stray too far. Of course, every day we fail in our attempts. But to quote from another verse from the Gita, it is by practice and discrimination that we will succeed. It says, the blessed Lord spoke, without doubt, O Arjuna, the mind is unsteady and difficult to restrain. But by practice, Arjuna, and by indifference to worldly objects, it is restrained. Eckhart says many times that our only goal should be to remain receptive, and that this is achieved by returning to silence and emptying oneself, being detached. In that silence, one hears the word of God, and God works through you. There are different editions of the Eckhart sermons, and what I'm going to quote you from now is the sermon number 1, but it's by Walsh, the Walsh translation. That knowledge is hidden from my soul, which is to her great advantage. This not knowing makes her wonder and leads to eager pursuit, for she perceives clearly that it is, but does not know how or what it is. Whenever a man knows the causes of things, then he at once tires of them and seeks to know something different. Always clamouring to know things is forever inconstant. And so this unknown knowing keeps the soul constant and yet spurs her on to pursuit. Again, this illustrates how knowledge of things can be an impediment, which is also mentioned in Patanjali's sutras. Knowledge of things, in the common sense, causes fluctuations in the mind, and God wants to be alone in the silence of your inner man, which is totally detached. Another way of being connected to your inner self is to remember that all nature and all creation is an expression of the highest power. Eckhart says God is in all things as being, as activity, as power, but he is fecund in the soul alone. For though every creature is a vestige of God, the soul is the natural image of God. Recently, I have been reading a paper by a gentleman called Joseph Milne, who was the person who first introduced me to Eckhart over 50 years ago. Joseph is a fellow of the Temenos Academy and a trustee of the Eckhart Society. In this paper, he starts by quoting a very early Christian called Tertullian, who lived in the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD.
I do not believe anyone would find it frivolous if he reflects on the majesty of nature, which is regarded as the wellspring of the soul. As much as you attribute to the teacher, so much you will concede to the pupil. The teacher is nature, and the pupil is the soul. Whatever the teacher has conveyed or the pupil has learned has been communicated by God, who is the teacher of nature. Whatever the soul can surmise about its original teacher, this power resides in you that you may reflect upon that which is in you. Be aware of that which has given you awareness.
So there is this powerful idea that God is the teacher of nature, or expresses itself through nature, which in turn is our teacher. This is so that we might be reminded of our own divine nature.
For the medieval monk or scholar, the natural world was made to convey knowledge of God. God aims the world at human consciousness because God desires to make himself known and to share his infinite being with created beings.
And further,
nature communicates to man the divine wisdom of God. Here, nature is shown to have come into being in order to reveal God. Every manifestation of nature in some way expresses divine wisdom, and man is created to receive the gift of this divine wisdom and to live by it. Nature is our teacher. We are her disciple.
detachment perhaps is a state whereby one is reminded by everything in front of us that in truth we are united and have no separate identity. My penultimate quote is from another talk given at the Eckhart Society by Ian Moore, quoting Gustav Landauer, who was a Jewish thinker from just before the First World War. Let us now transform ourselves into the spirit of the world. This is possible, an old master, the great heretic and mystic Eckhart, was right when he said that if we were able to comprehend a little flower completely as it is in its essence, we would have comprehended the whole world. He added, however, that we can never reach such absolute comprehension from the outside, i.e., with the help of the senses. The way we must go to enter into community with the world leads not outward, but inward. It must finally occur to us again that we do not just perceive pieces of the world, but that we ourselves are a piece of the world. The one who would grasp the flower completely would have grasped the world. So let us return completely to ourselves. Then we will have found the universe in the flesh. So finally, I will leave the last words to Meister Eckhart for you to ponder. The teachers greatly praise love, as does St. Paul, who says, "Whatever things I may do and have not love, I am nothing. But I extol detachment above any love. First, because at best, love constrains me to love God, but detachment compels God to love me."